Welcome back to Halloween in July, bones and ghouls. It's that special time of year where I discount the Patreon's yearly pledge rate as low as it'll go, and anyone who pledges gets on my patron apron. Take advantage of that yearly discount and you can get a special patron patch sent right to your door, or your own patron apron. Links are in the description below. Today we're going to look into a game that a lot of you have asked me about for quite some time, Darkest Dungeon. Going at the rate I'm going, I should be able to get around to Darkest Dungeon 2 sometime at around 2030 when Darkest Dungeon 3 and 4 are out, but that's beside the point. Darkest Dungeon is a spooky roguelite. You play as the descendant of a nobleman who got bored of just being absurdly rich, so he decided to get into the spooky stuff. He went a little too deep, and now he sent you a letter asking to come over and fix the problem. You're implied to be rich too, though, so that means you're not going to be doing it. You're just going to be hiring some dudes to do it for you. Tricksters, clowns, heroes, literally anyone who wants to go in there and just figure out what the heck is going on in the ruins of your family estate. The first thing you should know about Darkest Dungeon is that it's all Iron Man all the time. There are no saves to roll back to. There's no resetting the run. There are no do-overs. I'm pretty sure this game auto-saves every turn, and even if you were somehow to find a way to save scum it, that'd kind of defeat the point of the game. The game even gives you this little message every time you boot it up saying, hey, we're gonna do pointlessly cruel stuff like two-shot a maxed out character in one of the first battles of a dungeon because we're just hardcore like that. Maybe we'll try to have a conversation about hardcore versus unnecessarily cruel RNG later if I can remember, but for now, the idea is that you should buckle up for an experience on par with XCOM's The Long War mod. Your heroes you bring into the Darkest Dungeon are all archetypes of various professions you might expect to sign themselves on to go into a place where the nasty monsters are going to be the least of their problems. You start with Reynold the Crusader and Dismas the Highwayman. Don't get attached to them. Each hero has a role that they can fill that goes well with the other heroes, and you can even get creative and have a hero fill a role that they aren't necessarily expecting to be able to pull off, but it somehow works. While your usual lineup is tank, damage dealer, healer, and fourth person, also other healer most of the time, you can get creative with stuff such as using dodge buffs to make your team nigh untouchable and focus on raw DPS. You can use two of the same hero for great effect if you know how to build them. You can exploit the hell out of the Jester's buffs to nuke enemies into another game with crits. Some heroes are even able to play in multiple spots during the same outing through moves that change their position. Sure, there are certain combos that are meant to be used. You'll know them because when you set up a team, they'll have a little nickname on the roster before you head out to the dungeon, but where's the fun in that? I had more fun with my dodge build than with the Antiquarian and the Man-at-Arms than I did with, say, Invincible or War Party. You see a bunch of videos around YouTube of people trying to do stuff like solo with lepers, which, yes, a person with leprosy is a class in this game, or do the thing where you take Reynold and Dismas all the way to the end of the game. After sinking some hours into this game, I can tell you that it's going to be more fun to do a weird team than a balanced team. All heroes are designed with at least two roles in mind, and while you'll need to take out quote-unquote boring teams to make serious progress in the game, it's the experimentation and the, hey, I wonder if I can make this work mentality where the real fun's to be had. This goes both ways though. You can have a lot of fun making outlandish team comps based on what might work, but there's also what definitely will not work, and sometimes you'll find yourself doing a BS mission below what you're used to doing, or even trying to find a way to brute force reroll the missions available to you because you don't have a viable team comp available, like just something that's an absolute deal breaker or that does not work. For me, it was a lot of not having someone available for the fourth position or lacking a decent healer for what I wanted to do. Sure, some damage dealing heroes like the Flagellant can be surprisingly good at coming back from the brink, but they're very situational and not good for consistent healing. This game loves its BS damage, and you're going to need to have at least one primary healer plus someone else that can do patch jobs when the healer is busy making sure someone doesn't die before you're halfway through the run. That's actually a good segue into the expeditions, or what this game calls missions. Missions come in four flavors: scout the rooms, kill all the monsters in the room, do the thing around the dungeon, be it collecting grain, destroying altars, etc., and go fight the boss. All of these will involve going into the dungeon where the enemy encounters are one of the many things that can cause a TPK. You'll need to manage things like food supply, making sure that people don't have mental breakdowns even when they can't help but examine things they know are going to be extreme stressors, actual traps laid down in the ground, light levels, oh yeah, and dudes are gonna jump you even when you're not in the rooms. There's some things you can do to improve your odds, such as increasing your odds to scout rooms ahead of time so you'll be able to prepare for what's coming or outright avoid it, but your best bet is to always come prepared. That means having a low stress party, lots of supplies, and a game plan. While you're out and about, you'll also want to be hunting for treasures and trinkets. Trinkets aren't anything special in Darkest Dungeon, it's just the usual trio of common but near useless, a side grade at best, or extremely rare but actually useful. They can also be pawned off for money, which you're going to need to collect a lot of in dungeons. Money comes in two forms: money and things that will magically turn to money as soon as you leave the dungeon. There's also heirlooms, because of course we need like 5 different forms of currency before DLCs are accounted for. Money will be used to help de-stress your heroes after dungeon runs. Heirlooms are for upgrading your buildings in the Hamlet, and no, I'm not really sure how that works. Where this gets interesting is that you've only got so many inventory slots, and at some point, something's gotta go. You're gonna have to make some hard choices between if you want to grab an extra stack of crests so you can finally upgrade the guild so that you can upgrade all your heroes more, or if you want to make sure you have enough food to make it past at least one more random hunger check. Things can get ugly once you start failing those hunger checks. It's entirely acceptable to retreat from a mission even if things haven't started going badly yet. In fact, the best time to retreat is when you know things are about to make a nosedive if you keep going. You don't get any resolve experience, which is how your heroes level up for backing out of a mission, but you still get to keep all the stuff you found, which can get quite lucrative. Heck, most of your early game missions are where you're trying to build up your hamlet to take care of your guys, will be strategically going in, grabbing as much stuff as you can, and retreating before you take too much damage, because it costs a lot more effort and resources to train up new dudes than it does to just try to keep the dudes you have alive. Training a dude takes like a lot of money and time. An important factor in keeping your dudes alive is managing your stress. Stress can literally kill your heroes, and even if it doesn't, they can become afflicted, which is not only going to be a problem for them, but also a problem for the whole party. Stressors can be anything from walking around in the dark for too long to discovering spooky literature in the hallways, or even seeing someone on your team get punched in the face really hard. There are enemies in Darkest Dungeon that don't really do any meaningful physical damage to your party, but instead just deal massive amounts of stress at their targets. You should go for them first, because usually once one party gets an affliction, the whole squad starts to spiral. Afflictions themselves have small variety of what they can be, but they all boil down to your hero adding stress to everyone else, and sometimes outright refusing to obey commands and acting on their own, or even refusing to interact with other heroes, such as refusing to reposition or letting other heroes heal or buff them. There is a slight chance your hero might become virtuous at the high mark of stress, which is pretty much just anti-affliction. Your hero reduces everyone's stress and will do cool stuff. This threshold always happens at 100 stress no matter where you are in the dungeon, be it a fight or just walking around. If after 100 stress you somehow get all the way up to 200 stress, your hero will have a literal heart attack and be at death's door no matter how healthy they were before. Try to avoid that. So how do you deal with all that stress? How do you set up your expeditions? How do you do literally anything in this game that is not go to a dungeon? Well, that's what the Hamlet's for. The Hamlet is a place where you upgrade your heroes, but more importantly, can assign them to stress-relieving activities or send them to the hospital to get their diseases cured. Oh yeah, diseases are a thing in Darkest Dungeon, but they're basically just stat debuffs that persist until the hero goes to the hospital. You can send heroes to the hospital to have a disease cured, or even remove some of the weird quirks they might pick up in a dungeon that are basically also just debuffs or side grades, or you can send them to the temple at the inn to get rid of all those stress points, but unfortunately you can't do both at once. Some heroes will have favorite stress relief activities. Some will only have one activity they will do. Others will refuse to do certain activities. This matters because some stress release activities are a lot cheaper than others, or more effective than others, or you might not have enough slots in one area to make sure everyone can blow off steam. While you can take heroes that are already stressed out into the dungeon, it is in no way a good idea and should only be used as a last resort. If all else fails, there's always grabbing some new heroes from the stagecoach and starting again with a new expanded roster. Weird stuff can happen in the Hamlet too. Usually you'll get a recap of what happened at the end of the mission, and also there'll be a thing like if you do a certain mission like collection, you'll get an event where food for the next expedition is free. Sometimes it'll be things out of the blue like double the normal amount of prospective recruits at the stagecoach or free healthcare for a day. Other times it can be not so good things like a hero getting absorbed into the games at the gambling tables, disappearing on massive benders, or having religious experiences in the temple, which puts them out of commission for at least a week on top of the week they already needed to de-stress. I think this might also give them quirks sometimes, like if they have a particularly rough bender, they won't go to the bar to de-stress anymore, but I don't think I've ever had a hero disappear and never come back. I'll admit I also might not have noticed because I burned through so many heroes. When you aren't dumping gold into making sure no one stays mentally broken for too long to do their job for you, you'll be spending all those heirlooms you find on upgrading the facilities in the hamlet. To start out, both the temple and the tavern have only one character slot for each activity, which is bad enough for de-stressing all your dudes, before the estate caretaker or the town crier decide that they want to use the facilities too. You can upgrade your stress-relieving facilities not only to have more slots for heroes, but also so that it costs less gold to send a hero to each thing, while also being more effective. It's also a nice touch that the more you upgrade buildings, the less shabby they look, until the ruin you first arrived in looks like an actual town that people live in. It just so happens to be looming like under the shadow of a horrific ruin of a manor. You'll also need to blow through those heirlooms so that you can do the other thing requiring gold, upgrading your heroes. It's not enough for them to level up, which when I checked it would seem that resolve level mainly affects your resistances. You need to upgrade your heroes' weapons and armor at the blacksmith to increase like their base stats, and then train their abilities at the guild hall in order to get better versions of those base abilities that do more damage or have better buffs. We'll get into that grind later. Lastly, outside of the hamlet itself, you can also use blueprints that you find off bosses to build extra districts in the hamlet. These cost a ton of heirlooms, but also have some pretty intense buffs associated with them. I think most of these are meant for when you're later in the game and already have upgraded all the things that use a certain kind of heirloom to upgrade, but you're also allowed to swap heirlooms at any time in the menu in case you need more of one but less of another. However, things like the granary and the bank are extremely useful to have early on. Finally, for the hamlet, although I kinda could have put this anywhere in the video, are the DLCs. There are 3 major DLCs plus 1 minor DLC that adds new characters. Actually 2, but that other character is kinda just a reskin of another. The Crimson Court adds a whole new storyline with random encounters in normal dungeons. The Color of Madness is kind of an endless mode with a new batch of things you can buy and a new currency, and the Butcher's Circus is mock PvP. I took the game's advice and did not run Crimson Court on my first playthrough. I had Butcher's Circus installed, but never did it, and I frankly regret doing the Color of Madness on my first run. There's nothing wrong with it out of the box, I just found that while I was learning the ropes of the game, I didn't have a good grasp on managing my heroes, and it never went well whenever I went into the farm. In best case scenario, I just had a whole squad benched for another week, and I'm at a few grand to de-stress them. Also, the roaming boss it adds can be a real pain to deal with, even if you do get a warning that he's in an area. That usually just means as I'm looking at the menu, I have to do a potentially suboptimal run because the thing I was planning on doing, like say going after a boss, would most likely have to be scrapped because while the team I was getting ready is ready for that boss, it's probably not ready for the boss plus a random mini boss encounter because some of these bosses are close calls. Before we delve any deeper though, it's time for our cooking segment. We're gonna do something classic today. Spaghetti and meatballs. Easy to do on a baseline, but there's a lot you can do with it. I decided on the whim, the day I was filming this, that I was also gonna make my own sauce, so I filmed that too. Making sauce can sound intimidating, and I even had to shelve a version of a video last year because I learned that a lot more goes into canning than I thought, and I didn't want to accidentally put out bad, unsafe information. But if we're just making sauce for today with no intentions for long-term storage, it's pretty easy. Take a bunch of Roma tomatoes, the ones that are all oval shaped and probably would not make for very good cheeseburger toppings, and wash them off in the sink while making little X's with a knife on the tops and bottoms. That's going to prevent them from bursting. Now, while others prefer to just shock the skin off the tomatoes, I'm opting for using the whole tomatoes because I have a hand blender ready, and I just toss them all into the pot and wait for it to come up to a boil from just room temperature water. While you're waiting, make sure you've got a big bowl of ice water that's mostly ice on standby. As soon as that water starts boiling, we're just going to let the tomatoes stay in there for no more than a minute, preferably about 30 seconds, and then use some heat-safe tongs to take them out and drop them into the ice bath. Get them all out, drain the pot, and now put the now cool but still cooked tomatoes back in and murderify them with that hand blender. I'm using this hand blender here, which you can get these pretty cheap if you don't like get a fancy one with a million attachments, but in a pinch, a good old-fashioned fork or potato masher will do you fine. Once all the tomatoes are mushed up, add in a can of tomato paste and mix again before transferring into a high-walled saucepan so that we can add more stuff to it. If you really want, you can actually just keep this all in the first pot, but I can use my saucepan for the sauce, but I cannot use the saucepan for spaghetti. It's also going to come into play later with the meatballs. Now, we're going to add all the usual stuff here, namely garlic, herbs, and a rind of Parmesan cheese if you got that handy, while also adding a splash of white wine to help add a bit of volume to the sauce and prevent it from being too thick to spread. I add a bit too much here, but it's cool because I can just let this simmer down for a bit longer. If you don't want to use anything alcoholic for this, any broth of your choice will do fine. And that's basically the sauce. Just let it simmer on the low lowest heat setting until we're ready. Now it's time for our meat orbs. We're gonna take 1 part ground beef, 1 part ground pork, then add in breadcrumbs and powdered Parmesan cheese as stabilizers, along with getting some beaten eggs ready. Before you add in the eggs though, add in the herbs and spices you like to make these extra tasty, and then add in the eggs and just mix with your hands, like glove up if you need to. Now we don't want to get too crazy here. Just like dough, you can overwork ground meat to the detriment of the end product, so only mix it together as much as you need to get the ingredients evenly distributed with no pockets of anything everywhere before we shape them into balls. Now we want some mighty orbs to ponder here, so we're going to split these out into a dozen meatballs, shaping only as much as we need to get them roughly spherical because again, we don't want to overwork the meat. Don't sweat it if they're not perfectly portioned, you just need them similar enough to where they'll cook at the same rate. If you're not going to cook these right this instant, fridge them, and if anything, I'd suggest fridging them for at least half an hour anyway to let them rest and settle into their shape before we get going. Alright, showtime. Now cover a pan with some olive oil and get it hot. It would be a good idea to start heating the water in the pot that you're going to cook your spaghetti into, since that'll usually take a sec. Don't forget to salt your pasta water. Put all your meatballs into the pan and keep an eye on them. We're going to turn them over onto another side as soon as we see that the side currently touching the pan is browned up, and we're going to repeat this process until all sides on the meatballs are browned, making sure to get the top, the bottom, and all the edges. Don't worry about doneness in the middle just yet. Once the meatballs are browned up, we're going to transfer them into a high-walled saucepan with the tomato sauce we made earlier and set that onto a medium heat to get the balls finished. We're going to let these go uncovered for 2 or 3 minutes on each side before we reduce the heat to low and covering the saucepan. This should take about another 10 minutes or so, which hopefully will start at around the time you're going to put the spaghetti into the boiling water, but this is less of a time thing and more of a when it's done thing. Have a thermometer ready, and remember that since we've got ground beef, ground pork, and egg in here, that these need to be at least 165 degrees of freedom heat units in the middle before we can eat them. In the meantime, put your uncooked spaghetti into the pot, letting it soften up just a bit before using the tongs or something to gently bend the rest into the water, and then letting that go to 6 to 8 minutes. Like, you're cooking spaghetti here, it's not the craziest thing. Once the spaghetti is all done, strain it and set it aside. Check on your meatballs to make sure they are the right temp before killing the heat and plating up. There is a chance they might not be quite done by the time the spaghetti's out, but the spaghetti is fine waiting for just a little bit, whereas you might not be so fine if you have raw meat in the center. Just give it some time and let the thing do its thing. It'll cook better if you keep the lid on it, and once it's done, you can plate this up. Use a ladle to get some of that sauce out and pour it over the pasta, remembering that yours will probably be a little less watery than mine since I got a bit carried away earlier. Now add a meatball or 2 and cover with some Parmesan and maybe some basil leaves if you got them handy, and you've done it. You've got yourself a nice spaghetti dinner while avoiding any frozen crap from the supermarket pre-made aisle. Okay, time to go over the story's premise and a few other things. The premise of the Darkest Dungeon, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, is that you are the descendant of a nobleman or something that got into some spooky stuff and now he needs you to come fix it. Game ensues. Everything else is pretty straightforward. There are 4 major areas you will be doing the bulk of your missions in, and each of them has 2 bosses in it which you will fight several iterations of. It's going to take quite a few successful runs before you're even given the opportunity to take on missions that let you confront bosses though. Most bosses have similar stories. The ancestor was doing a thing and then he came across some person that turned out was able to help them, but then things got a little too wiggly and the ancestor had to distance himself from them, or the thing is a direct result of the ancestor's experiments. There are some outliers here, like the prophet who was immediately onto the ancestor's shenanigans and the ancestor had to deal with him in a way that means that now you have to deal with him too. It's around this time you might notice something that I at least call the treadmill. I think other people use the term, but from what I understand, it's not universal. It's the idea that you start to notice a game has a very repetitive gameplay pattern and that you're grinding a lot but not seeing much progress or new things. It's not always a bad thing as long as there's some progression. A lot of treadmilling can be excused or even enjoyed so long as you're having fun. The best kind of treadmilling is where it's so fun you don't even notice that you're treadmilling. It's very common in roguelites but also common in other types of games like co-op shooters, say like Payday 2 or Deep Rock Galactic. Darkest Dungeon is a roguelite, so it's to be expected in some respect, but even other roguelites like Binding of Isaac or Streets of Rogue still have some meaningful progress between runs. You'll unlock a new character or new bosses. You'll have new items added to your pool, that kind of stuff. While Darkest Dungeon does have some progression as you unlock things, such as upgrading your Hamlet to upgrade characters, you start to notice that even though you're doing harder dungeons, it's noticeable that you're doing the same thing over and over again. In fact, you'll start to notice that even in harder dungeons, you're fighting almost exactly the same groups of baddies, except for occasionally you'll see one or two new ones that are usually harder enemies, which will be either tanky as hell or have some absurd buffing scheme. In fact, you'll start to notice a lot of enemies in certain roles act in a very similar manner between areas. You'll also notice that when you confront bosses later on in the game, they're not even reskins. They're just the same boss you fought earlier with a slightly different name and more bulk. And that's when we start to notice the other issue Darkest Dungeon has. When you're doing that much permadeath and negative consequences of leaving heroes benched or in bad situations, the RNG needs to be at least a little forgiving at times. I've done more runs that I'd like where I lost heroes to consecutive low rolls, and it'd be okay if the low rolling was something I could either play around or have a little consequence for resetting like in other roguelikes. At times it's pretty hard to play around the crits because you just end up getting put into a box and wailed on for things beyond your control. An example of doing bad RNG right that I can think of off the top of my head is like in The Binding of Isaac. Say you're playing as Isaac and you get a first floor soy milk. Even if you aren't playing with the D6 or you already used it somewhere else on the level, Isaac can just ignore that item and move along, hold R to just reset the run without consequence, or just say, fuck it, we ball, and take the soy milk and plan an absurd run around trying to build around soy milk. In Darkest Dungeon, when you get a low roll or wind up in a bad spot, you have to take a pretty bad penalty to retreat, and then you're worse off than when you started thanks to it being a persistent game. Sometimes these low rolls get so excessive that you'll have something happen like a hero you just finished maxing out getting killed in a round and a half from full HP even with you trying to heal them because an enemy rolled high a couple times in a row while you rolled low. I found a phrase I was saying quite a bit when I was playing was, what the shit? Like, I swear at times it felt like I had Eric Cartman as a dungeon master, with the way I get randomly jumped on out of nowhere, even when I carefully played up to camping just before a boss encounter, just to have an ambush put me in a bad spot, or have a random encounter have a couple consecutive high rolls that kill my main damage dealer from full HP inside of 2 rounds just before we get to another boss encounter. It takes a long time to get a hero up to level 6 and a lot of gold to max him out. Even with getting the recruit at the highest possible level, which is 3 out of 6, you're going to need to babysit them through quite a few runs where things can go wrong. And to make matters worse, you cannot take high level heroes on lower level missions to babysit because they just outright refuse unless you've got a rare special event happening in the Hamlet. And this time investment isn't even considering the massive amount of time you need to grind heirlooms to make it possible for level 3s to spawn in the carriage in the first place. At default, they spawn at level 0. I was over 50 hours in when I was finally able to get a party that was ready to enter the namesake Darkest Dungeon and have a chance of making it out alive. I got to the end of the first one and beat the boss, which was a beefed up version of a roaming boss that you can come across and provoke at your own risk in the ruins. It only cost me my healer too. Then I come to find out that after successfully bringing a well-balanced party into the Darkest Dungeon, I was not allowed to ever use those characters for it again. I was nearly 55 hours in at this point and took a peek at my Steam friends list to see the playtimes of other people who own the game. The person with the least amount of hours who had the Chivo for getting to the end was at 96 hours. And it was at that point that I had to tap out because I was already way behind on this video and a bunch of others. The problem for me here that on top of the game really starting to get the treadmill going was I have to get all these videos for Halloween in July finished. In case you didn't know, part of the reason I do Halloween in July is because these videos are things I can make in advance on the back burner over the course of the year, upload ahead of schedule, and then use to allow myself to take a bit of a vacation because in case you weren't aware, YouTube doesn't really give you sick pay or PTO. That's the theory anyway. I'm working on these videos, with this one being the last one I'm making right up until the final days before July starts, and last year I ended up having to work a couple weeks into my supposed vacation despite working through weekends leading up to July back then. I figured out why this was though, and why the original Halloween in July's worked so well in the first place. Horror games tend to be on the shorter side, ranging from 6 to 10 hours, with some even being about 4. But last year, I played a bunch of mechanically intense games ranging in the 20s of hours, and this year I've got Alien Isolation, which is pretty long at least for a horror game, and a monster of a grind in this game. Hell, the reason I've been showing my prototype apron in the mock-ups of patches and all the videos is because between taking care of the majority of the housework while my wife does the IRL Darkest Dungeon run, all the new releases that came out this year, and all these time-consuming games for Halloween in July, I simply have not had the time to go down to my local maker space and run off the first few batches. Hell, I haven't had time for my own personal stuff, like working on parts of my novel for a writer's group or continuing the D&D campaign I'm supposed to be running for my wife and her classmates. This is 100% on me though. I've figured out the issue now, and I've learned that I need to thoroughly research games before I even get started on a video, let alone saying I'm going to be making a video about a game, because sometimes things don't work out and I need to be mindful of the limited amount of time I have as a single person that does every last thing that's a part of this channel, all while doing the cooking, the fixing things, the upkeep required to maintain a household, and all that good stuff. Just bear with me. I'm just one dude. Now, I'm sure if some of you have already commented before getting here, I am aware that Darkest Dungeon 2 is a thing. In fact, I started this video like back in early February with like starting to play the game and take notes, but I have to juggle a lot of things, so I gotta do these in advance. I'm not sure if I'll be doing a video on that one though, given all the things I've just said. However, I understand that the grind has been significantly reduced at the cost of other things. If I do, unfortunately though, it's not gonna be a candidate for Halloween in July because I need to keep a tighter grip on what counts for this little extravaganza we do. And I need to finish that Kenshi video and maybe try to start the Pathologic 2 or Disco Elysium videos I talked about back in December. You know, things I really want to do. One thing at a time though. Darkest Dungeon is a hell of a roguelite and a good time in small doses. You really start to feel the grind and the RNG BS after a certain point in longer sessions, and it really takes away from all the cool stuff developer Red Hook did with these heroes and the tactics of party positioning when you're groaning because you just lost 2 heroes to bad rolls in a single fight, fresh off losing someone else in the last expedition. I think I'd have a totally different take on this if things were just a little less RNG heavy, or if it was a little easier to start re-rolling things, or at least maybe have some meaningful differences around you as you progressed, and not just, oh, look at the spooky change in the backdrop, like actual like in the dungeon stuff. As it is though, grinding up heroes only to be facing the same enemies in the same tile sets is frustrating, and sometimes I swear the game was about to pop up after I had like dudes die, was a screen asking if I wanted to use dungeon coins or some crap to redo a fight instantly, or remove all the stress from my heroes, and if I tapped it I would be taken to a purchase screen. Because I may as well say it, sometimes Darkest Dungeon has big mobile game grind vibes at times. Like, I still enjoyed some of my time with it, it just leans a little too much into being quote unquote unforgiving in the name of stretching that runtime, and there's only so much you can say is skill issue when you're just getting smacked around by RNG and crits you can't play around. That's gonna do it for today. Remember to do all the algorithm things if you wanna, and check out patreon.com/charlatanwonder, where yearly pledges are discounted as low as they'll go, and you can get your own sweet patron patch or even your own patron apron with a yearly pledge. Now let's sign off. Remember that no matter what you do, be it drawing, writing, or stacking rocks in a cool way, what you do is not content, it is art. Content is a word that has been twisted into meaning a way to reduce everything you do into meaningless slop, meant for nothing more than to make some line go up. Your art is better than that. Your art is an inalienable reflection of you through your stylings, your experiences, and all your passions which were imbued into it through the nature of its creation. So fight against the march of content by fighting for your art. Stay sassy, everyone.
Look at this boy all spread out and relaxing in the sun. He is quite long. He is quite rude. You kept us up all of last night just screaming at the air conditioner. Do you have anything to say for yourself? You bit Mommy when she was trying to just get up and go to the bathroom last night. In almost the exact same spot you bit her last night. Just sitting there, flicking your tail as if you haven't done anything wrong on the empty yogurt box that you seem to like better than all the others. You even, look at these little, you're even doing violence on the box. All this belly fluff is just holding your violence glands. Sir. Sir. Gotcha, bro. Gotcha, bro. Oh, you think? Oh, yeah. I've got tougher skin than mommy. You can't actually break my skin. That's why daddy handles you. Scritch. Surprisingly receptive. Alright. I'll leave you alone now, but you gotta promise me that you're gonna be better tonight.